Father Sergeant? So, I will have your men. Even numbers. Form 2 lines on the double. So.
That was a clip from the 1964 film Zulu, which was filmed nearly a century after the Anglo-Zulu War. It is considered generally pro-imperialist, so it's interesting that even a century after the Anglo-Zulu War, you still see Europeans sort of romanticizing their presence in South Africa as well as other places. But the other reason I wanted to show you a clip of that is that it's generally considered a pretty accurate portrayal of what combat in the Anglo-Zulu War was like. And if you'll note, the Zulu warriors have their work cut out for them because they're going up against British troops with modern repeating rifles. And these guys basically just have a throwing spear and stabbing spear, an impi, and a shield. And that's basically it. The Industrial Revolution may begin with textiles, but it slowly but surely begins to industrialize everything else, including the production of increasingly advanced and modern weapons, such as repeating rifles and machine guns. European powers themselves understood the lopsided advantage that modern technology gave them, and there was a little rhyme referring to this, referencing the Maxim machine gun. And it said, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." So if you don't want to just sit back and be colonized, what do you do? Well, the answer is a little bit of everything was tried, depending upon the particular situation. So natives across the world would sometimes try traditional military tactics, diplomacy. They would use literary propaganda. They would try to use nationalist political advocacy, and even spiritual practices to resist Europeans, like we talked about with the Ghost Dance movement. While these tactics could often stall the Europeans and make things very, very inconvenient for them, they very rarely resulted in outright victory. So even the victories that were obtained by native forces, such as the Zulu victory in 1879 during the Battle of Isandlwana, even though they win the battle, they end up losing the war. So we're going to go over a few examples of indigenous African resistance movements to Europeans, and they really do run the gamut. We have in West Africa, Samori Touré, who actually sort of forms his own empire and actually defeats the French in a key battle or two. You also have the Ashanti queen, Ya Asantawa, who wages a war for a literal golden stool. Now, for the Asante people, the golden stool is the most important relic for the Ashanti. So this is, by the way, the stool in question, and I mean, hey, it does look like a pretty comfortable stool to sit in. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting is that in resisting the British, Queen Ya also encourages women to rise up against them, but ultimately, the British, while they take heavy casualties in the war, they ultimately prevail. You also have the emergence of the Sokoto Caliphate in modern day Nigeria, and this was used to establish the Islamic regions, mostly concentrated in the northern part of the country. It fought both the British and the French to resist imperial expansion, but ultimately the Sokoto Caliphate collapses by about 1903. Finally, in southern Africa, we see an example of spiritual practices being used to combat Europeans in the Zoja cattle killing movement, which admittedly doesn't sound too spiritual, does it? It begins with a Zoja prophetess named Nankawuse. She apparently has this dream in which she is told that slaughtering unclean cattle will basically allow for the resurrection of the ancestors of the Zoja, and that combination would basically drive the Europeans into the sea. Unfortunately for the trouble, the only thing that happens is 350,000 cattle are killed, and this ultimately sparks a real huge famine without any measurable progress against the Europeans. Although, hey, props to the Zoja for literally trying to fight the British by triggering an actual zombie apocalypse. Speaking of colonizing, I have successfully colonized Miss Evans's room. Although, I guess this could be taken as a confession and could be used against me. So, no, I have not colonized Miss Evans's room. I would never do that. So, we're going to talk about the economics of imperialism. And if you've ever heard of the term globalization, imperialism and globalization kind of go hand in hand with each other, believe it or not. So, the idea of globalization is that you have a worldwide economy that's linked, there are reduced tariffs, and free trade, more or less, is the order of the day. Now, that's not a perfect system that you see in imperialism, but let's say that the global economy was fairly globalized. But it comes at the expense of millions of native people. So we see coerced African labor that are forced to do things like work on plantations. They're doing things like bronzing, mining, especially with the discovery of diamonds and gold, and felling forests. And of course, that's all particularly bad in plantations that you're looking at in the Belgian Congo. You also see palm oil for West and Central Africa, and these are used for machine lubricants. It literally lubricates the industrial revolution that's happening in Europe. So this is an economy that relies on forced labor. It also relies on labor migration. So because empires like the British and French span the entire globe, they're able to take people from one part of the empire and encourage them or force them to move to another part if there's a labor advantage. So for example, you see essentially indentured servants from places like India being sent to work on farms and plantations in southern Africa. We already talked about this as a driving force for immigration. Some of that is voluntary, like, for example, you see lots of Chinese migrants immigrating to the United States to help build the railroads in the United States, especially, but also Canada and Peru. You also see Chinese laborers working on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, gold mines in South Africa and Australia as well. You also see the Japanese and the Chinese, or Japanese and Chinese laborers working on sugar plantations in places like Hawaii, African laborers working on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The list just kind of goes on. Africa undergoes some industrialization, more or less to expedite the flow of materials out of the country. So, for example, you see the developments of some ports and some railways and that kind of thing. But still, the idea is that goods are going to be manufactured exclusively in Europe. So, except for these railways, except for some of this basic infrastructure, the colonial economic system was one of extraction. In other words, you're taking out of a country, you're not really investing anything into it, which is one of the reasons why after these empires collapse, especially after the Second World War, many of the countries that they have ruled over end up being incredibly poor. So in addition to coerced labor, you also have the issue of taxation, where many European colonial governments impose a tax system on Africans, which either had to be paid in cash or cash crops. This forced free Africans to basically work for the colonists, where they're basically donating their labor as some form of taxation. This is also during a time period where you see many non-state or private examples of ownership of colonies being changed to state or governmental control. King Leopold II's ownership of Congo is given to the Belgian government, which, to be honest, is probably somewhat of an improvement. Not that says more about the state of the Belgian Congo than it does about the Belgian government. And finally, this is also the time period where the Dutch East India Company basically gets absorbed by the Dutch government. You also see European colonies throughout the world start to specialize in the production of certain commodities and goods. This is kind of in keeping with David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, where it's more economically efficient for a country that specializes in a good to invest more in that specialization. So in India, you see shipbuilding and iron and as well as textiles. Egypt, you see textiles and cotton cultivation. Congo, as we already talked about, rubber. West Africa, palm oil. Peru and Chile, you actually have guano, which is bat poop. It's extremely good fertilizer, which is why it's in high demand. In Chile, copper, and in South Africa, diamonds, and as well as when they can find it, gold. So how do these social hierarchies work in the colonies? Well, these are social hierarchies where colonized people are basically placed on the bottom of the hierarchy in their own country. And so we've seen situations where that happens time and time again, whether you're talking about the Norman conquest of England, the Aryan conquest of India. One of the things we see is this is a very unstable kind of system, because if the majority of the population realizes that they can come together and overthrow the conquerors, well, it's game over conquerors. Well, the reason that doesn't happen very often is because of the European principle of divide and rule. We already talked about within that idea being used in India within the British Raj, and it's not used exclusively there. That is a strategic tool that's used throughout Europe's colonial empires. So, for example, Europeans would frequently use animistic and Christian Africans against Muslim Africans. Native Christians tended to be favored in colonies over non-Christians. And to a certain extent, what that does is it sort of leaves an elite privileged class of Christians whenever the Europeans leave. So, for example, in French Indochina, specifically Vietnam, there's a large population in the south that converts to Catholicism. Generally, the more north you go, the less Catholic and the more Buddhist it tends to be in Vietnam. And some of those long-standing differences between the Catholic parts of Vietnam and the non-Catholic parts of Vietnam lead to the partitioning of the country between North and South Vietnam, and it's one of the contributing factors for the Vietnam War, actually. So these uses of divide and rule, not only do they have dramatic effects at the time, they have dramatic effects over a century after they're employed. Now, most of your European colonists are living in the comparative safety of big capital cities within the colonies. So, for example, you're looking at your Singapores, your Calcuttas, your Cape Towns, etc. And most of the day-to-day administration was carried out by locals. Christianity is promoted by missionaries, missionaries like David Livingstone, who was pretty famous for basically spreading Christianity to African people. The spread of Christianity, or rather the success of that spread of Christianity, kind of depended upon the area. Higher education was not promoted due to European racial prejudice. More on that in just a second. And you do see Western language education being taught by Christian missionaries. And of course, in parts of Africa, this is so strong that you see that a large chunk of the African continent still speak English and or French as their first language. Now, European colonial policies will stunt the growth of a Western-style middle class in these colonies. There's a variety of reasons for that, but a lot of that has to do with the extraction of the economy. Also, middle-class societies are based on human capital and investing in the people of a society. And if you're withholding higher education, if you're doing things like encouraging forced or coerced labor, that ain't happening. During this time period, Europeans preferred not to socially mix with native peoples. This was a time period where white racial supremacy was basically taken as for granted. In other words, it was just assumed. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But basically, white Europeans tended to seclude themselves or segregate themselves into sort of ethnic enclaves in capital cities. Laws regarding interactions kept these relationships at a minimum. And where those relationships did exist, there were very often unequal relationships. In other words, a lot of times Native peoples were used as, for example, domestic servants, that kind of thing. So today we know that race is what we call a social construct, or in plain English, is basically an idea that people make up to suit their own interests, whatever those interests are. But during this time period, we have the emergence of what is called scientific racism, where the idea of race tries to be scientifically expressed and defended. So an example of this scientific racism is an incorrect application of Darwin's theory of natural selection called social Darwinism. Basically, the idea here is that just like there are winners and losers in nature, there are winners and losers of humanity, winners and losers of between nations. And so the fact that you have people who find themselves colonized, well, that just demonstrates that they're not fit to survive. Note that it's not a moral defense. It's what we call amoral. In other words, it's not really even bothering to make a moral defense. It's non-moral whatsoever. This same argument, by the way, is used to defend the fact that there are winners and losers in this increasingly capitalist and industrialized global economy. So the idea there is, just as there are winners and losers in nature, so too are there winners and losers of the economy. And it's not right, it's not wrong, it just is. So again, not a moral defense. It is a defense that doesn't even go into morality whatsoever. It's just an explanation for why things are the way they are. So there's nothing really scientific about scientific racism. So as an example of this, we see the field, and I use that term extremely loosely, of physiognomy. This is the theory that you can assess a person's character or ability based upon physical qualities or traits. So, for example, if somebody has very large eyes, maybe they're very inquisitive and very intelligent. Maybe if they have small eyes, they're not very intelligent and not very inquisitive. So physiognomy gets applied to racial traits, and it's used to basically justify the superiority or dominance of white culture over the rest of society. So the dominant view was that European culture was superior and there was no need whatsoever to show any interest in the native cultural practices of the people they colonize. Except there's one wrinkle here, and that is the fact that there seems to have been this extraordinary fascination called Orientalism. So, this is a time period where, especially in art, we see lots of interest in the Middle East, Asia, and you could even sort of apply this to fascination with Africa as well. Um, so this fascination was a direct result of colonialism and imperialism. And you see this especially in France. This is something that you can kind of argue begins with Napoleon's conquest of Egypt and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Remember, that's a huge leap forward for Egyptology, and you have like this renewed interest in all things having to do with Egypt. So the idea here is that Europeans are supposed to be civilized and superior. So superior that, look, you have this picture of the Turkish bath by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. So this is obviously not civilized. Look at how not civilized naked people are. So this is supposed to be a picture of the Ottoman Sultan's harem, where he would basically have all his wives and concubines. And the idea that they would lay around naked all day is frankly absurd and ahistorical. And Henri had never actually been to any harem whatsoever, and yet the Europeans paid this, almost as if Ingres is using this as an excuse to paint naked people. But harems aren't the only thing that get fixated upon. Any non Western cultural practice that seemed sufficiently exotic was focused on, like, for example, opium smoking, which has nothing to do with two British wars in China, the use of peacock feathers. Anything that seemed dissimilar to European culture was fixated upon and then ridiculously exaggerated. Now, it's easy to look back on practices like physiognomy or theories like social Darwinism and say that they're absolutely ridiculous. And of course, they are absolutely ridiculous. But what's even more ridiculous is that people actually believe them. In other words, they weren't being cynical at all in advertising these theories. Europeans, well, at least many Europeans, legitimately believed in them. And they believed in the civilizing mission that they felt had befallen them. And I say befallen judiciously because you see this idea expressed in Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. By the way, Rudyard Kipling is more famous for the book The Jungle Book. So you can read the poem here. I'm not going to recite it myself because but the idea is that European civilizations are supposed to send forth their best to the colonies to basically lift them up and enlighten them. But tell that to the 10 million Congolese killed by a deranged European autocrat. And on that depressing note, it is time to end. Till next time.